Good evening. Welcome to tonight's Savvy Chat. I'm Jen Horangeff, your host from Savvy Cooperative, and today we are joined by a very special guest of mine, Greg Brodsky, who is the founder of Start.Coop. It's a new accelerator for early stage co-ops like Savvy, and he's here to talk to us tonight on how to build and scale co-ops, which is a really important topic, one that's very close to our heart here at Savvy. As being a young co-op, there haven't been a lot of resources for us. So he's going to help kind of talk about what he's seen in the past and really kind of share that experience of what it's like to build a co-op. So Greg, please say hello and let our listeners know where you're calling in from tonight.
Hi, Jen. Hi, Savvy listeners. I'm calling from Boston, Massachusetts. We're located in Jamaica Plain, and I'm at my house, and we just put our son Oscar to bed.
Nice. Well, my surroundings are a little different tonight. I am down in DC, ready for an FDA meeting tomorrow. So welcome to my Airbnb. But we're glad that you were able to join us tonight. Super excited to talk about this. October is co-op month, so we're continuing our new series of talking about co-ops.
Great point.
And yeah, and so this is something you clearly know a lot about, but I want you to kind of help catch our listeners up to what got you into co-ops. You know, you've been working in them for a long time now, but everybody's kind of got their origin story. So how did you even get into this space, and were you always interested in co-ops?
You know, the word co-op is such a mystical, magical word. And when I talk about this, sometimes I explain that I kind of hate the word co-op because everyone's heard of it and no one really knows what it is. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the way I got into this is when I was growing up in Manchester, New Hampshire, my dad ran the local carpet store, right? Not that exciting, except for the year that that carpet store sponsored our soccer team when I was like 9. That was amazing. But when I was about that age, actually, my dad started this co-op. I didn't understand what a co-op was, with a bunch of other carpet store dealers around the country. He was part of a national association of carpet store guys, and they were talking about some common challenges they had. And so my dad and about 8 other guys sat in a room, and he said, hey, you know, we could benefit by working together. You know, we're all buying similar stuff. We have similar marketing needs. We could probably do some common training. You know, what if we form this co-op? And so that's how it started. And for years, you know, that group was very small. And then sometime around high school, it became a big enough thing where my dad actually had to sell the store to help run the co-op. And I think I still didn't understand what it was. And in college, you know, I was part of a food co-op, and I'm like, what in the world does what my father does with carpet stores have to do with our local food co-op? But that group, called Carpet One, now has 2,000 stores around the country, and they buy and sell more floor covering outside of anyone except for Home Depot and Lowe's. And so it became this amazing story. And my father was one of the 2 co-founders. This amazing story for how the local independent store, in this case floor covering, could stay local but still have the scale of competing with the big guys, you know, which is harder and harder in each industry. So, you know, my particular passion, you know, was not in floor covering. It was in bicycles and bike stores. And so when I was about 25 here in Boston, I was working in a local bike shop, and I was talking to my dad one day about the challenges of our local bike store. And you know, we just talk about business and those sorts of things. And he said, you know, have they ever thought about a co-op? And I said, no, but, you know, tell me more about this co-op model. I want to understand what you guys really do, because it is such an opaque word sometimes.
I can't say that I, even though we have a co-op, I wasn't somebody who is any co-op expert. I've heard the term, I belong to some co-ops, but I didn't really quite understand what it was.
Right. Exactly. And so, you know, I think we should talk a little bit more about what they really are, you know, and kind of take it out of the clouds a little bit. But just to finish the rest of my story, you know, that was the beginning for me of, we formed a purchasing co-op for retail bicycle stores. So that group, called the Bike Cooperative, is still around today. And there's about 250 bike stores around the country where behind the scenes, you know, they're not branded in any common way, but behind the scenes, we help these bike shops negotiate bike frames and seats and brake levers, and also things like credit card rates and marketing. So that's really how I got into it.
That's interesting. I mean, you have such a personal story with your family. I think that, yeah, many of us that kind of stumble into co-ops, we still don't necessarily know all the ins and outs. And we were just talking about this on the last episode of, I didn't know what a purchasing co-op was before I kind of got into this space in the past couple of years. I didn't understand how that was part of it, because we've entered into it sort of on the tech side and the consumer sort of co-op area. Right. And you've been in tech before and you've worked outside of co-ops. So, I'm also curious what made you kind of come back to them as something that's still interesting to you.
Sure. Yeah. So I started and ran this bike store group for 10 years, and I just needed a change. And I was approached by someone who was working in the tech startup space, and and tech startups have this sexy thing going on, right? I mean, who doesn't want to work in a tech startup if they can? Jen, you're living the dream every day here at Savvy, right? But yeah, so we went off and we tried to do this tech startup that would actually support independent stores. I was hoping it could support purchasing co-ops, and it was fascinating. I think I learned a lot. There's a lot in the tech startup mindset that's super helpful about agile development and lean startup theory, and you can Google those if you're interested in them. But what was and we raised a lot of money. So we were actually funded by Tony Hsieh, who's the CEO at Zappos, was the lead investor in our tech startup. I ran business development, and overall they raised $29 million for this project.
What?
It was insane.
Wow. That's
and there's a lot of reasons this tech startup did not work. I will say, one of those reasons was the desire for just speed at all costs, right? And I think one of the reasons I like the co-op model is, the people you're serving are the owners of your model, and they get, short-term need versus long-term planning. And in the tech startup mindset, there tends to be this notion that, fail fast, go as fast as you can. We're going to give you money so you can just do everything fast. And which can be really great, but I think a lot of it comes from the investor's point of view. If they want to figure out right away if this is going to work, and if it's not working, they don't want to put any more money in. But sometimes that speed actually creates repercussions where you don't, you're not really doing the right thing, right? You're not really spending time to be thoughtful with your customers. So anyway, so we ended up burning out really fast. We're this classic tech startup story where we had all this potential in the world, and we totally blew it. It was shocking.
Interesting. Yeah. I hadn't heard that story before, but yeah, I mean, I think it's something that tech companies are prone to, and not every company even gets that much funding to even play with. But then the responsibility of, once you do get that money, what do you do with it? And I think that that's where something that we're seeing in the co-op space is that it can be more challenging to get that kind of money. So I'm curious what you're seeing too, now that you've been involved in all these different kinds of co-ops. Like, what are the challenges that you see in building them? Are they the same that other tech companies or any company have?
Right. Well, I think they're really different sets of challenges, right? So, I mean, I think the co-op model has this challenge around, people understanding it, around getting funding. Tech startups have other challenges in terms of, how do they not do what we did? How do they do the right thing and not just satisfy their investor side? What I'm personally interested in is kind of this intersection of tech startup culture and co-op culture, right? Because I think if we kind of separate them out a little bit, there's some wonderful things about tech startups in terms of the mindset and this, and being fast, being agile. But the ownership model is different, right? And so in my worldview, all a co-op is an ownership model. We can take it out of the clouds a little bit and say that it's just a way of giving people ownership, that most of the time you have the consumers on one side and the investors on the other side, and never the twain shall meet, and they're totally opposite motivations. And I like to tell people that, all that a co-op does is bring that Venn diagram together. So you're saying, look, you, the people we serve, actually own it, right? And it's a fundamental shift. But when I explain it that way, they're like, oh, well, that actually makes sense. But so I think you can give people ownership, aka the co-op model, and some governance rights, and still be agile, still be responsive, still have technology. So that's what interests me is, how do we avoid this false choice of, co-ops are kind of old-fashioned and feel like your 60s food co-op, and tech startups are all sexy and lean. How do we kind of take the best of both worlds, and blend them together. But to answer your question, this is what I see in co-ops. And actually, we did some research a few years ago. My father and I are associated with this nonprofit called Co-ops for a Better World. And, you know, it turns out if you ask people, do they like what co-ops are? 78% of people, the shockingly high number, say they're more likely to support a co-op's goods or services compared to a traditional corporation offering the same thing, right? 78%, that's like a crazy high number. At the same time, only 11% of the population can actually say what a co-op is, okay? So again, there's this sort of halo effect. People like co-ops, but they don't know what it is. So let's if it's okay for a second, I just want to, you know, tell people how I talk about it. So sometimes I even skip the word co-op and I just say, look, let's call it a distributed ownership model, right? Because co-op again is this loaded word. And somehow if I say it's a distributed ownership model, you know, we're giving the constituents ownership, we're sharing profits, we're giving them governance rights. People are like, oh, wow, that actually sounds great. I wish we had more of those things. You know, that solves a lot of where I don't like where the economy is headed. So they like what it is. And then there's this question of like, why aren't there more, right? And so I think, you know, that's what a lot of us have been thinking about. If people love what these things are, you know, why don't we have more of them in our society? And so I think you have these really beautiful but niche case studies. You know, people talk about sort of hyper-local stories of co-ops, but then there's some really niche big ones too. So you have Ace Hardware is a co-op owned by hardware stores. It's a purchasing co-op like the one I was involved with. REI is a co-op of consumers. Ocean Spray is a co-op of cranberry farmers. Land O'Lakes is a co-op of dairy farmers, right? And so again, you know, it's just an ownership model, right? So you have these really niche stories. So why don't you have more of them? Why are they kind of like the exception rather than the rule? So we started to think about this a lot about 2 years ago, and we have two parts to the theory. And one is that it used to just be an easier landscape to start co-ops, right? That if you were starting a company 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, you weren't competing against Amazon and Walmart, right? And so starting something today is a lot harder. You actually just need to bring more, you know, it's sort of an arms race, right? You just need to bring more resources to the table. And the second part of the theory is that there's just a really poor ecosystem for co-op development. And again, to contrast it to the tech startup landscape, if you want to start a tech startup, there's blogs, there's academies, there's angel investors, there's VC funds, there's all sorts of books and resources, and it's a really rich ecosystem full of experts, and so the models don't feel mysterious at all. In contrast, the co-op landscape just feels really fragmented. There's not a lot of recognized experts. Again, it feels a little too mysterious. So a big part of what we're trying to do with Start.Coop in this accelerator program is just to start filling the ecosystem for people and to isolate, you know, what are the things everyone needs? Okay, let's just start solving that. We don't need to have everyone recreating the wheel and to bring the resources to one place.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, it's really something that we encountered when we started our co-op is that, you know, I had this idea that this sounds like a co-op from my limited knowledge of what that was. And then just kind of went online to learn, have all these resources to teach me what a co-op was and how to make it work. And they weren't there. And so luckily I was able to find other co-ops to be able to reach out and talk to. But beyond that, there weren't a lot of actual resources, like you say, to go and like say, this is how you do it. And here are examples and all that great stuff. So that definitely was something that was lacking. And, you know, when I was on my search to look for other co-ops as well, I'm faced with other co-ops that didn't feel similar to me, like other, like you say, purchasing co-ops, which again, I had no idea what that was, like worker co-ops, which are something that are very important, but didn't quite match what Savvy was doing, and then found this niche of platform co-ops, which we talked about on the last episode about having these tech platforms like what Savvy is that could be co-owned by the users of said platform, like an Uber or an Airbnb, et cetera. So, you know, my assessment was those other co-ops didn't feel similar enough to what we were doing for me to necessarily learn from. But I'm curious your sort of perspective, since you've seen it from, you know, many different angles. Do you think the challenges are the same or different for all these different types of co-ops?
I think they're more similar than I thought. You know, my father has a saying that, you know, when you've seen one co-op, you've seen one co-op, and I think about that a lot because, like, the reality is, you know, what you guys are doing at Savvy is so special and so unique compared to any other co-op. But on the flip side, I think the challenges are similar if we think at a high enough level. So you know, you guys are probably want to raise money to invest in technology more. There's this question of, you know, how do we grow in a way that empowers our membership? How do we create, you know, authentic member engagement where the community feels good about it? I think this is a great example of that. How do you create a strong organizational culture? How do you do governance? And you know, how do you just have all the tools and resources you need to run the business? So there are some common buckets, even though the execution is different overall. And a lot of our approaches, you know, how do we almost give people templates, you know, within platform co-ops or within worker co-ops? How do we give people templates? Or the other metaphor we use sometimes is, how do you give people a recipe, right? And so the reason I love the recipe metaphor is, you know, Jen, if I give you a recipe for, I don't know what you make well, but, you know, if I give you a recipe for butternut squash risotto, right? You might make it totally different than someone else, but at least you know these are the elements that go into it. You know the shopping list, you know the order in which to do things, and then you can go out and do what you want with it. But you know, it doesn't feel like you're figuring it out for the first time.
I'm so excited we got a quality analogy in here. For those who don't know, Greg is a master of this, so keep your ears peeled for more of them as they come in through the conversation. So I happen to love butternut risotto, so this is fantastic. I've never made it because I hear risotto is terribly difficult to make, but yeah, if you guys put that together at Start.Coop, then I'll be on board with it.
Jen, this is great. My wife has an amazing recipe. We'll share with you after this.
Excellent. Perfect. In my copious free time, I will learn how to cook better. It's actually been a little hobby that I have sort of picked up. It's very sort of therapeutic for me, so maybe I will. Maybe I will.
Perfect.
So, okay, so kind of like talking about that, of all these different sort of recipes, if you will. Curious how you sort of think about that and how you'll address some of those things with Start.Coop. So you created this, you saw a need to be able to help these co-ops get off the ground. And here we are, our first class, for those of you who don't know, because we just learned, but we are going to be part of that. Savvy is part of the first cohort.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. So we're super excited. And, you know, looking at the other co-ops that are now part of this, I'm curious from your perspective, how you feel we are in the scheme of like where on our journey we are compared with what you thought we would be. Because when you and I first connected, I even told you, like, I don't want to be part of another accelerator. We've done this before. You know, we've kind of already got that initial, you know, high level biz dev or whatever. And honestly, we felt like we were kind of not getting as much out of it as maybe others did because we didn't have the co-op aspect. But so I was like, nah, I don't. Now that you have kind of this first class, do you see any sort of similarities in sort of the stages that we're at?
Yeah, well, you know, I do. When we started the accelerator idea, we thought that we'd be getting people just ideas, saying, you know, I have an idea, how do I make it into a business? And the reality is that people were farther along. You know, people like you. I mean, you guys have done an amazing job with Savvy, and I think the reason people were further along is there was sort of this backlog of people who were trying to do something innovative in the economy. You know, this whole notion of how do we share profits with our constituents? How do we share accountability with them? So I think people have been working on these really interesting projects, and we'll be sharing out the other people in the cohort. And we're kind of waiting for, you know, how do I scale up? And so there actually has been way more in common than we thought in the initial class, and people have been further along.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and something that I've noticed is we just kind of had to figure it out, good, bad, or otherwise. Without those resources there, we've kind of all been stumbling. Hopefully that makes it easier for the next co-ops that come along. But I think that we couldn't wait. I certainly had people at the beginning when we started out to say, oh, this co-op group's going to be working on developing those things out. But when you are operating like a startup, you're like, great, but like, I don't have time to wait for that kind of stuff. So you just have to keep going and learning and trying to figure it out, even though, maybe it is taking you longer or you're using more time and resources, but you just have to keep going. You can't wait until it's time.
Yeah, and I think that's the hard part of being a startup, right? Is you're sort of doing this triage analysis in your head every day, which is, what do I need today, and what do I have time to actually do? And yeah, so I mean, you and several other people just had to figure it out, and you guys have done, like I said, you guys have done a great job. We just want to help people take it to the next level.
Yeah, well, that's what we firmly said. We don't know enough about the co-op aspect. Building out a financial model is one thing, but then how do you take into account how you're redistributing those profits? What does that look like? Our tax bracket is different than other companies. That's different. All those different things of member engagement and everything else. It's a different story. When we were part of these other accelerators, they just didn't quite take that into account. So some of that just kind of fell short for us. So I'm really excited to see what Start.Coop can do to help the co-ops kind of along the way. And I did notice that you guys have more of like the purchasing type co-ops, but you also have some of us platform co-ops. And I think it'll be interesting to see the kind of resources that are needed for both kinds. And are there real similarities, or is it different? And that could be a really interesting learning as well.
Yeah. Can I give another wacky metaphor, since now I like wacky metaphors?
Please do.
A metaphor I've been thinking a lot about doing this work is that I think building a co-op today is like building a website 15 years ago. And what I mean by that is, if you were building a website 15 years ago, you had certainly heard of a website, right? Everyone had heard about it. And, if you said, yeah, I really want to have a website, someone would say, oh yeah, I know a guy who did that once, and let me see if I can introduce you. And I don't quite understand how he did it. And I know it was really expensive and it took a lot of time. And I don't totally get it, but let me have you talk to him, right? And I feel like that's still kind of where the co-op field is. And if you think about building a website today, what's great about it is you can still do that totally custom development path, but now you have Squarespace and Wix and Weebly, and you have WordPress, right? And so I think there's enough room in the landscape to give people templates. So let's take some of the mystery out of it and make it a real thing and say, this is how we do it, and this is how we build success stories. And I think what's nice about it is the more success stories that there are, that has sort of a amplifying effect for other people.
Yeah, I love that. I do feel like that there just aren't those resources. And I built our website because it was that easy now, and I am not a programmer. So I think that analogy goes very well. Hopefully it'll be that easy for other people to build co-ops in the future. But yeah, I mean, there just hasn't been any sort of way to do that. And I do know that others are working on like co-op starter kits. But again, where we were in our stage was just like, great, but we just don't have time to wait because our members need things and we have a service to provide. And what I thought was interesting too, when you come back to like what you're saying about that, 78% of people say they want to work with co-ops or, they want to support co-ops. It's interesting because we thought that our members, our patients and those who would be interested on kind of serving on that side of the platform would care about the co-op, but not really the kind of our clients, because we thought at the end of the day, they just want a service. What do they care about if we're co-op or not? So we didn't bank on that. But it turns out they do, because if they have a choice of where to give their money and who to, patronize, they rather do it to something that actually serves the people that they are saying, at least, that they're serving also. So it's interesting that it did have a little bit of that sort of strategic advantage to it, to being a co-op. And that's something that, unless other companies completely change their structure, which I don't believe they will, does actually have a benefit for the co-op. And I think it's really interesting to see if that's something that grows and that more people will be pushing for co-ops in maybe unusual places, like in patient advocacy.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just this desire these days to do something more, right? And so I actually saw this article the other day. I don't know how sincere the intent is, but Uber is looking at ways to try to give equity to their drivers. Okay, that blew me away because that's obviously not our perception of Uber. Now, I don't think it will be the amount of equity that a co-op would do. You know, it might be some fraction of a fraction, but I think there's just the sense that the challenge of our economy these days and capitalism in general is no longer about kind of bigger, better, faster, right? Like it's very clear we can consolidate wealth. It's very clear we can get things delivered next day. It's very clear we can have bigger companies buy up smaller companies. I think we solved that, and I think people are kind of like, okay, you know, we've proven we can, you know, make the world a worse place and make a lot of money. So I think the more interesting question these days is how do you provide the convenience, the service of a traditional company, but then also bring in this element of real meaning, of authenticity, and giving your constituents, whether it's consumers in your case or maybe employees in another case, or both, ideally, a real seat at the table, versus just saying, you know, we're just going to kind of extract you for the wealth component or the labor component. And I think that question of how do we give people a real seat, that gets people's attention, right? Because people are looking for an alternative. And I think, you know, while we're at a level of co-op supplying us and you're at a level of consumers belonging to your co-op, I think what they have in common is people are looking for alternatives to just traditional capitalism these days.
Yeah, well, you know, we are actually a multi-stakeholder co-op, which I know you know, but our members and others listening in, we do have an ownership class for our employees. And, you know, we've been talking with other people as we've just been talking about growing our team and things like this. And I think from the worker standpoint too, they think that that's really interesting because some people that have been in tech for so long are fed up with it, that they want to have more ownership and a say in the product and the company that they're creating. And, you know, we talked about this on last week's episode about how I didn't even hear about Uber talking about giving equity, but Airbnb is talking about giving equity to their hosts. Yeah. And, you know, Jason, our co-op lawyer, was explaining how that sounds nice, but that's really only in the event of them, you know, selling or having some sort of liquidity. And so otherwise, you know, what do those individuals get out of it? And there's no governance there. They don't have a say in anything. They just may get some money at the end of the day if something happens.
Right. That's the question. How do you do it in an authentic way? And you know, an example, it's not an analogy, sorry. An example I use a lot these days is I like to talk about, you know, REI versus Whole Foods, right? And how, you know, Whole Foods sold out to Amazon, and I don't really know anyone who feels great about that, especially people work at Whole Foods, but even, you know, those of us who are consumers and used to like shopping there. But it happened because, you know, a certain amount of their shares were owned by venture capital firms, forcing them to sell out for a higher price, right? The founders didn't even really want to sell. They just felt a lot of pressure to maximize shareholder value. And shareholder value is, you know, when it's external shareholders, just becomes the end all be all. If you contrast that with the REI model, you know, I love to explain that REI probably would never do that because they're owned by the people they serve, and there wouldn't be a value in that for the REI shareholders. And so that's what I love about the co-op model is it really aligns the interest in a different way. And so, you know, look, if REI was owned by external shareholders and all they cared about was profit, they wouldn't be closing on Black Friday to let families, you know, go out and hike or be home with their family. So you know, who owns the company really does matter in terms of what comes out of that institution.
Yeah, well, I think too, you know, we recently became a public benefit corporation as well. And I didn't quite realize that all co-ops didn't have a social mission. And I think that's something interesting too, that becoming a public benefit corporation ensures that we have a social mission. So we can make those decisions about, you know, whether we close on Black Friday. That's not really what we would be doing. But in that case, it would really cost the shareholders a lot of money. But if you have that firmly planted that that is part of the social good that your organization is doing, then it justifies it. And you don't have to say, we can't do this because we got to go make more money. And that's just not the luxury that traditional corporations have, because they do have to, that at the end of the day, that is why they exist. And
right.
There can be ethical businesses, but still at the end of the day, they have a bottom line.
Yeah, and it's really hard. So anyway, and that's why you guys are ahead of the curve. I mean, being a co-op and a B Corp, you guys are checking all the boxes. So.
Well, we are progressive, but, I think we always like to leave our listeners too with some sort of like practical advice that they can go do and think about how to kind of support these causes, be it, to be more patient-centered or to help support more co-ops in the world. So do you have any sort of parting advice that people can think about as they go back to their lives tomorrow on either how to support co-ops or how to be, more thoughtful in their decisions when they think of choosing between brands or anything like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's always more co-ops in your community than you think. And so, I like to remind people that credit unions are co-ops. We don't think of them that way, but they are banks owned by their consumers. Okay, so again, if you think of a co-op as an ownership model, and we just simplify it down to that, credit unions are absolutely co-ops. And I read a great article recently that, credit unions actually earn people more money, about a point better on average, whether it's a savings account or a CD, because they don't have to give that extra money back to their external shareholders. They're giving it. Their consumers are the people they serve. But so I think supporting your local credit union, supporting your Ace Hardware over Home Depot. There's kind of these hidden co-ops in your community that you can support. There's a group I mentioned, Co-ops for a Better World. It's at coopsforabetterworld.coop, which is a nonprofit that tries to share amazing co-op success stories. So those are some things you can do. It's just, get out and, it's always hard to put your money where your mouth is, but I think it's what we're all trying to do.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I think our members and those listening in hopefully will take a curiosity to at least be, thinking about these things as they go back to their lives and see if there are ways that they can make an impact in ways that seamlessly fit in. I think that's really like the challenge of co-ops, is to make sure that we can be, like you say, be the next Walmart or be something that's an easy choice for consumers. But hopefully our consumers will also help to drive those forward. So
can I make one more plug?
Please do.
We have one other co-op in a group, and Jen, you haven't met these guys yet, but I've mentioned to you. It's a really cool, one of my favorite stories beyond Savvy is a group called Red Hen Collective. You can look them up on the web. And so what they are is a feminist worker-owned wine importing company based out of the Bay Area. And so what they're doing is their mission is to pay fair trade wages to the wine growers around the world who usually get left behind. And so they're going to pay those growers first every season, so they can pay their pay their communities. And it's a great story. And they're actually doing a fundraising round right now for their co-op. So if people are looking for a really cool story, and you eventually want to get paid back in wine as well as profits, you should totally go check them out.
Yes, I think that's awesome. For people who want to get paid in wine, that sounds like the perfect way to put your money where your mouth is. And wait, there's another way of saying that. Put the wine where your mouth is. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's awesome. All right. Well, before we close, I got to do my same rapid fire questions that we ask all of our guests, just to get to know people on a little bit more of a human level, because we all have our lives outside of these things, I hope. So when you are not being savvy and helping others like myself create great co-ops, what are you doing for fun?
Well, we have a 10-month-old little baby, so my wife and I were talking the other day how it's a little less fun than we used to be. We talked to friends this weekend that we're going to Salem, Mass for a horror movie. We had some other friends that were going apple picking, and instead we were inside because our kid has a fever. So it's not that fun these days, but so this is really the highlight of my day, if I'm being honest.
Your child is going to listen to this someday, and you're going to say it was so much fun. But
whether he wants to or not, we'll make him listen to it.
There you go. All right. So what about something quirky that people don't know about you? I love this because people share things that I just never would have guessed.
What's something quirky that people don't know about me? Let's think. I used to be a DJ on an internet radio station here in Boston called radioboston.com. So it was kind of like ahead of the curve. So this is like 2000 to 2004. So we broadcast all live Boston area musicians. It was really cool. I never got paid, but it was a great gig. It was probably my favorite job.
What? That means that I could have listened to you back when I was still living there.
Yeah, I'm not saying I was great, but yeah, you totally could have tuned in.
I listened as I changed the channel. I moved from Boston in 2002, so I could have listened to you for 2 years.
Yeah.
Well, I did not know that. Next time I need somebody to like mix some sweet beats for me, I'm coming to you.
Yeah, well, it's so hard to do a mixtape these days. I used to love making mixtapes for people, but now it's like, sending someone a Spotify playlist, it doesn't have that same magic,
I know. I've done that though, but I was that kid too that would call into radio stations to request a song and then sit by the radio with my like tape player to record it. So I was a big mixtape person.
That's awesome.
And it leads in perfectly to my question about playlists. And this is what I joke that I love making playlists. And so somehow I've still made it part of my job here at Savvy to curate an awesome playlist. And so I need to know from you, what song title do you think best describes either the current state of healthcare, which we usually ask people, or in your case, perhaps the current state of the economy?
Well, you told me you're going to ask this question, so I was thinking about it. And for some reason, I've been hearing a lot of Peter Gabriel's Games Without Frontiers on the local college radio station here. And I think it's such an interesting song because, when I was growing up, Peter Gabriel's top songs were always Sledgehammer, Big Time, and they were like the iconic songs. And now Games Without Frontiers is the top song. And I feel like it says something. If you go to Spotify, it's like now his top ranked song. And I feel like it says something about sort of the current zeitgeist of where we are. Cause it's kind of this like, I've never fully understood what the song was about, right? If I'm fully honest.
It's not what I'm asking. I'm just looking for the title anyway.
Yeah. I feel like it's this like cynical song about like world politics and everyone's manipulating everyone else. And it's kind of this like, we can't really help what's going on, but this is what's going on, and no one feels good about it. And it's got all these words about like, games without frontiers, war without tears, and it doesn't sound good, but it's where we are, and I feel like we're at a place where people know there's bad stuff going on, but we don't know how to get out of it. So that's where I feel like we are.
Wow, well that
doesn't down. Sorry.
Make me feel super uplifted, but that's okay. We need those real songs to get to the core of it because let's say we've had people do, what was last week? Jason did Here Comes the Sun.
Oh, well, geez, okay. I guess I'm being a buzzkill.
We all bring something different to it. So that's awesome. And circling back to our other question about, kind of trying to get to the bottom of what people feel like the biggest healthcare headaches are. And while you're not specifically in healthcare, we're all touched by it. So I'm curious from your perspective, what do you think kind of one of these biggest challenges that we need to solve in healthcare is?
That's really interesting. I'm going to give a really specific answer just because I used to work with purchasing groups. I used to work with this group of bicycle stores. Prior to doing this program, I worked with brewery owners around the country. I actually feel like people need to solve for what people call small group insurance. So there's this whole concern about, can you leave your job because you lose your insurance? And if we can allow small businesses to join groups around the country, whether it's groups of consumers or groups of businesses, it solves for so many things, and it brings down the cost of healthcare, and it takes it from where you're no longer getting a good healthcare rate just because you work for IBM versus a local company. If you think about any other insurance you have, whether it's home or auto or pet insurance, it's not tied to your job, right? And so if we could just say, we're going to separate from our job and you can join any other group plan that you want, to me would solve so many things. And I think that's always on my mind because it's something I always heard from the local owners of these bike stores and breweries.
Yeah, no, that's super important and something that, we're facing now as a small startup too, is how can we be competitive with those great benefits of companies that can pay more but might not be doing the best sort of social benefit. So I think that's a great one to add.
Yeah.
Well, we're wrapping up here. I so appreciate you taking the time to join us tonight and share your wisdom about co-ops. It's so great to be working with me for months now and really kind of helping to guide Savvy around some of these co-op challenges. And I'm grateful that you're able to now share that with our listeners as well as with your first cohort of Start.Coop. It's going to be an exciting ride and we can't wait to be a part of it. But before we end, is there anything else that you want to plug for our listeners to know about?
Well, I already plugged Red Hen Collective, so I think go check them out. They're a great group of ladies on the West Coast, and yeah, they're looking for support right now, and they have an amazing mission. So,
amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Greg, and thank you to all of our listeners now and in the future. We are so excited that you guys are trying to get savvy and learn more about co-ops. And please join us next week. We're going to have a really special episode where we're going to be talking with our co-op members on the eve or two nights out eve of our 1 year co-op anniversary. So we're really going to bring it back home and be talking to some of our early members and get their feedback on kind of where we are and help set the stage for us entering into year 2. So thank you, Greg, for joining us tonight. And to everybody else, we will see you next week. Until then, stay savvy. Bye-bye.